Hello everybody, Titan Slayer here, bringing you another helpful and informative video on how to improve your builds in Smite. Just loading into Jungle Practice, our usual stomping grounds for all this. And today what we're going to be going through is my top 5 tips for Smite builds aimed at a more beginner introductory kind of level. I do plan to do a more advanced one of these at some point where I go into some of the details that you more experienced players might want to consider or will want to be aware of and have a good understanding of. But for now, this is going to be some of the things that I see new players not doing and why they should be doing them, pretty much. Or sometimes things that they do and should not be doing. If that makes any sense at all, then congratulations, because I'm not sure if it did. But we're going to start with the first tip, the first loose-fitting rule, if you like, for building. Something you want to follow most of the time, unless there's a particular reason not to, and that is buying boots. Boots are core items on pretty much every god, in pretty much every build, in pretty much every game mode. Not only is movement speed an incredibly valuable stat, getting that early movement speed is really helpful, be it if you're a squishy trying to run away and survive, or chase someone down and get the kill, or move around the map and farm, or a tank get into a fight or get out of a fight, or doesn't matter what you're doing, doesn't matter what your role is, doesn't matter what your god is, movement speed is incredibly valuable, and boots give a quick and significant amount of that. Nothing else gives that much movement speed apart from a Bumber's Mask, a very niche item, and nothing else gives movement speed that cheap either. Not only that, but you actually get really good stats for the cost of the item. If we look, for example, at Shoes of the Magi for a mage, also known as pen boots because they're the boots that give pen, pretty self-explanatory, you get 55 power and 10 magical penetration for 1600 gold. If we look at the penetration tree, you get, for flat pen, you get 30 power and 10 penetration for only slightly less gold. So you get about half as much power, the same penetration, and no movement speed. Boots is just so much better value for your money, as well as that movement speed. And it's the same with the other boots. Getting that early cooldown is handy on a lot of gods, getting that early mana can help, you still get a good amount of power and of course the all-important movement speed. If we look at tank boots, that can give 100 health, up to 21 protections and 20 crowd control reduction. If we look at things that give a mixture of health and defense, for example Hide of the Urchin, you get ever so slightly more protections, ever so slightly more health and a bit of mana for exactly the same cost. I think it was 1550, but you don't get that little bit of power, you don't get that crowd control reduction, and you don't get that vital movement speed. So again, the boots are just really good value for your money. There are occasional exceptions where you can get away with not having boots and not having them early, and that is when the god that you're playing works very well with specific movement speed items and builds several of them. An example of this would be Bakasura, and he can rush Golden Blade for the jungle camp clear, and then he can get Hasten Katana for sticking to his targets, for the attack speed, for really chasing people down, and the general movement and clear, plus the movement speed he gets from his passive. In that sort of a situation, you can sometimes skip boots, because those two items are both really strong on Bakasura, have a very clear use, and you end up with enough movement speed to skip boots, and those items give enough of a spike for him, Golden Blade being a spike to his jungle clear, and Hasten Katana being a spike to his ability to chase down and stick to and kill his enemies, that you can get away without going boots. Another example sometimes would be the ring build on Freya. You get a bit of movement speed from Hasten Ring, you get a bit of movement speed from Demonic Grip, you get a bit of movement speed from Telkine's Ring. You end up with more movement speed than boots overall, but it's riskier because she is a fairly immobile, squishy mage. Not having that early movement speed from boots, you'll take a lot longer to get a decent amount of movement speed online, will put you at risk because you're very easy to focus and very easy to kill when you can't move. But most of the time you will want your boots. I see a lot of newer players not getting them, and it's almost always a mistake and almost always causes some big problems for them. Moving on to point number 2, and that is finishing items. Another thing I will often see on newer players is they will end up with a build that looks something like this because they decide they want a little bit of everything and end up with not really a lot of anything. Now what we've just spent there, we've just spent about, if you give me a moment, we've just spent maybe 5,000 gold or so. I think we've got about 1,000 here, up to about 3,000 there, and then about another 2,000 there. So put all that together, you get 4,500 to 5,000 gold, and we've ended up with actually not that much. We have a pretty low amount of power, we have a tiny amount of lifesteal, we have no penetration, and we don't have a lot of anything else. We don't have a lot of mana, we don't have any cooldown. It's just generally a waste of gold to go onto items like that because of the big spike that you get when you finish items. We can spend less gold, for example, and get just as much power, more lifesteal, some penetration from our boots, which isn't showing for some reason. There we go, it needs to reset, so we end up with a bit less power, but we do have Bancroft's Talon. Passive, it gives more power and more lifesteal when you lose health. So as well as similar stats, more lifesteal, bit less power, but pen to make up for that loss of power. You end up with a really powerful passive, you've got the full movement speed from your boots, it's just a much, much better way to spend your gold. As with most things, it's not a hard and fast rule, and what you will often see, and often a good idea, is starting an item to give you your early pressure for wave clear, for example, because you can't afford boots straight away, so you can get something like a tier 2 Book of Thoth for the power and a bit of mana, and then when you go back to base you can get your boots, and then the next time you go back to base you can finish, for example, your stacking item or your Bancroft's Talon, or if you're playing a different class, this could be a Transcendence or a Devourer's Gauntlet on a Hunter, it could be a Jotun's Wrath or a Crusher or a Brawler's Beatstick if needed on an Assassin, or that sort of thing. But most of the time, before moving from one item to the next, you will want to finish that item, and you certainly don't want to end up with something like what we showed at the start, where you just end up with lots of partially complete items, because it doesn't really provide a lot. We've just spent actually a lot of gold and not really got a lot out of it. Big waste of gold, and that puts you a long way behind your opponent in terms of fighting potential, because they will have a much stronger build for the same amount of gold. So don't do that, it really messes up your build, messes up your power, just messes up everything about it really. Another thing that I often see new players not doing, we're going to jump up a few levels for this, and we're going to just stack our passive, because I chose Thoth for it didn't stack my passive, never mind, I thought it did, but that doesn't matter, we can still show it. Penetration is something that you always want to put in your build. It's not necessarily something that you need immediately, and it can be delayed if other items are perhaps more important to get. That varies on the situation, that's a more advanced thing, but you will always want some penetration in your build. If we look at our stats here, the bottom section, the third one, we have 61 physical protection and 48 magical protection, just from simply the base stats that our god has. Now that's a full item worth of physical defense, depending on the item, and pretty much a full item worth of magical defense, depending on the item. So we've got pretty much a full defense item's worth of defensive stats on each side. Yes, you're a squishy, yes, you're quite easy to kill, but you still have those base protections, and so does everyone that you are fighting. They go up as you level up, but even at level 1, there's some. So you always want penetration to combat those built-in protections that every god has, it will just always increase your damage. If we look at a quick view into how penetration works, for example, if we have 2 penetration items like this, we have a total of 25 flat penetration. What that means is that we will ignore 25 protections of whatever god we are targeting. So for example, if we were targeting a mirror image of ourselves, we have 25 penetration, we have 48 magical protections, we are a magical god, so we would be hitting them as if they only had 23 magical protections. Going from 48 to 23, you'll take a lot more damage. There's also protection reduction, such as Spear of the Magus, which actually takes away the protections that the enemies have, so you would actually, if we were being hit by that, we would actually see our protection stat decrease. But I can do a video on the details of penetration at some point, or there's lots of good guides already out there to that sort of thing if you want to know more about it. But it's something you always want to put in your build, it just increases your damage. Now, we're just going to show something with Thoth here. There's a reason I picked him. He gets penetration in his passive, and he is not the only god to have pen built into his kit. This is the sort of situational thing where you might not need to build as much. You will still need some, because 15 flat pen against any team, even if they are all squishies, it's not really enough. You could build another pen item and get a big boost to your damage, but just be aware of what your god has in terms of what you're building. That is another thing that we will have another video on at some point, knowing your god. But moving on to the fourth thing that I often see newer players doing that really messes up their build, that is overcapping. Returning to our old friend, the stats table, we can see our actual stats, the numbers in white, and if we buy a few items, we'll see now, for example, if the interface decides to work, that we have some power, we have some lifesteal, we have some penetration, we have some cooldown, or that sort of thing. You can also see these smaller numbers in grey just to the right of those. Those are the caps. If you build more than those, or if you have more than those in general, you won't get any more benefit from it. So if we just build the entire pen tree, for example, we now have 40 magical penetration. What else gives penetration? We could get a Deity Plate Helm, taking us up to 50, and we could get an Attacker's Blessing, and that would take us up to 60 penetration if I could just stack it and get the passive, but it doesn't, because the cap is 50, you can't go any higher than that. And I often see newer players with simply too much of a particular stat. A common one is cooldown. You can only go up to 40% cooldown. So if we find ourselves building more than that, again, it's a waste of stats, and a waste of stats is a waste of gold. You're spending gold for something and you're not actually getting it, because all you're doing is pushing yourself further over the cap, and it's a waste. You could spend that gold on a different item that would give you stats that perhaps your build is lacking in, and it would just be better value, and you'd end up with a better build. And all stats have a cap. Some of them you're not exactly likely to reach. I don't think it's possible to have a build that has 4,000 mana or 5,500 health, for example. But cooldown reduction, attack speed on hunters, all that sort of thing, those are things that can often and easily be overcapped, especially if you get some of it from the god that you're playing. For example, if you're a hunter with a high attack speed steroid, you don't want to be building 2.2, 2.3 attack speed, because when you use your steroid, you will be going way over the attack speed cap. Same with, for example, Isis, who gets cooldown as part of her passive. All that sort of thing you need to be aware of, and just make sure that you don't overcap your builds. It's a wasted stat, and having a rough idea or knowing what these caps are can really help with that. If you're playing a tank, and you're overcapping on protection of either sort, it's not making you any tankier. You're not getting any more protection, it's just more wasted stats. And moving on to the fifth and final point, and this could easily be a video all on its own, and at some point will be, and that is counter building. And that is basically the rule of, and this is the most hard and fast rule that there is in this video, don't have the same build in every game, even on the same god. You will need different items depending on what you're up against, and sometimes depending on what you have on your team as well in terms of your allies. Sometimes, for example, you will need some anti-heal, which we have as a mage in Divine Ruin. We could also get Toxic Blade, but we're a mage. We're an ability-based mage. We don't use our basic attacks primarily for damage, so that would be a wasted item. Or sometimes we'll need more penetration, such as percentage penetration, because we'd be against a team with a lot of defense, so we need that percent pen to break through that defense. Or we might be playing a tank, and we might be against a mostly physical or a mostly magical team. All that sort of thing is what you need to bear in mind, because if you have the same build for every game, you'll either try and kind of have everything, so you might have some anti-heal and have some percent pen and all that sort of thing, but then find yourself in a match where you don't need it, or you go without it and then find yourself in a match where you do need it. And that is why I always recommend do not use auto-buy, because that means you go into a match with 6 items already laid out. There are going to be some changes coming to it. Hi-Res have kind of teased that's a plan for, I believe, early Season 6, to be able to have situational items in your default builds. But regardless of that, it's much better to just be able to decide the item you want as you're going. You'll end up with much more flexibility in your build, and you can really make sure that each item you pick is well considered and well chosen, rather than just trying to stick with the run-of-the-mill build that you use every time, and you end up lacking in these key counter items, depending on what you're against, or depending on what's on your team. If you're playing a tanky god, and most of your team do a lot of damage with their auto attacks, you might want to increase their attack speed, help them out a bit. That sort of thing as well. We won't go into too much detail on counter building, because it could very easily be a video on its own. So instead we are going to leave it here. So with just a quick recap. So you pretty much always want your boots because it's cheap stats and movement speed is crucial. You need to be able to get around the map, you need to be able to chase your enemies, you need to be able to escape your enemies. Very important. Finish your items, don't just get a bunch of tier 1 and tier 2 items here, because you get far less stats for the amount of gold that you spend. It's just not worth it. You get a lot more benefit from finishing off your items. If you are a damage dealing god, if your priority is to deal damage, you always want penetration against your enemies. It can be okay to delay it sometimes if you find yourself needing another situational item, or if there's a particular item that's very strong on your gods that you want to get sooner, such as a Gem of Isolation on Poseidon, that kind of thing, or a Bancroft's Talon on Sol, or there's lots of items that are strong on lots of gods. That means you can delay your penetration, or if you need to counter build the enemy team, you can delay penetration that way. Just always plan to have some at some point in your build, and try not to leave it too late. Make sure you don't overcap on something like cooldown, as we're doing here, because we now have 60% cooldown, but it only goes up to 40. So we've wasted gold on cooldown that we don't actually get. And finally, counter build the enemy team. Don't go into each game on the same god with the same build. You need to be able to change your items depending on how the game is going and what you are against in the general situation. and for that reason don't use auto buy. I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's been informative. It should set you well on your way to much better smite builds if there was any of this that you didn't know. If you could drop the video a like if it helped, if you could comment letting me know what else you want to know. If you have any questions off the back of this video, I would be more than happy to answer them. If you have a suggestion for anything else you want to see in future videos, I'm here to teach, I'm here to help, so I'm more than willing to take requests. And if you want to keep up with all the content I will be releasing in the future, then don't forget to subscribe. It really helps me spread the channel and help as many people as possible. That will be it for today. I hope it has helped. Bye everyone.